Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thanks also to my two fellow speakers who've managed to set up the conversation really well. And I'll try and make sure that I don't argue with any of their points over the course of my presentation. Hydropower is a controversial topic, right? You've heard some of the issues that have come up already. IUCN is not an anti-dam organization, far from it. Hydropower has a core role in sustainable development, increasingly as we try and achieve the Paris Agreement goals. But there are a lot of bad projects out there that have caused a lot of damage, and there is a lot of global learning on how to do things better. And yet applying that learning is complicated and difficult, and, as you would expect, political as well. Just to go over a little bit on the benefits from dams, we've heard about them from Maria earlier on. They provide a range of benefits to society, and actually there are follow-on benefits from those because we need reservoirs to store water for a variety of different reasons. And as that fleet of assets, so that fleet of hydropower dams around the world in different locations ages, so does the need to improve that infrastructure and invest back in it to keep it working. But at the same time, it also provides an opportunity to install turbines and generate electricity from those existing infrastructure that doesn't have a turbine and therefore contribute to low carbon emission electricity generation. So hydropower does have a role going forward for sure. Not only that, but it also provides the ability for other renewable energies to come online into a national energy grid. So if you have solar, it only works when the sun is shining. If you have wind turbines, it's only working when the wind is blowing. Now you can store some of that energy in batteries, but again, that has costs and it has a lot of other knock-on environmental impacts. So hydropower actually is an important stopgap in that mix of different renewable energies so that you can use it strategically with other renewables. And in most countries, they look to build renewables, solar and wind and tidal, when they have a certain level of hydropower capacity as well. So it's an important element to it. And you'll see the quote on the slide there from the World Commission on Dams in 2000. Dams have made a significant contribution to human development. And that means all dams, not just hydropower dams, but of course, hydropower is perhaps the ultimate economic multiplier because it's energy. And for every $1 you invest in that energy generation, you provide a huge range of economic multipliers for economic development and rural employment. There is the statistics to say that for 1 megawatt provides 10,000 rural jobs. So if you're in poor countries and you're in remote mountainous areas where there's not a lot of employment, there's not a lot of opportunity, hydropower provides energy to people and it provides rural employment because of the knock-on effects economically. So they are important elements of society and of our economies. However, they have, as you'll see the quote on the left of the screen, in too many cases an unnecessary and often unacceptable price has been paid to secure those benefits, in particular on environmental requirements and for those people who are displaced by dams or affected negatively by dams. And there are some fairly horrific stories. I won't go into them, but I have some examples of dams that I've seen that are not working as best they could. And I'll give you a few examples around that because there are some important lessons to learn about how we make sure we don't repeat those problems, which is what both the previous speakers have said as well. They do cause these unintended consequences, so they fragment our river systems. I know of one dam that has caused water problems 350 kilometers away on lakes and river systems that affects people's access to water because of just bad planning and bad design and shifting competition. If you build a dam and people are a long way away reliant on those flows, in between where the dam is and where other people are, you will have increasing competition for water, and you will also have climate change. And so it affects how the system works in reality. But this also biophysically fragments the system. It can disconnect rivers from groundwater and disconnect return flows. It displaces local communities. It leads to a big loss of aquatic biodiversity, including some of those species that are not, there are not many left. So river dolphins, for example, around the world are under threat due to dams. leads to tension, but also cooperation between states. So many of the river basin organizations in Africa were first energy organizations. They were there to guard and develop a hydroelectric power station. And from that point, they then increased capacities to start managing the river system because they need to protect their flows. And to a certain extent, we as society rely on dams. So once it's there and it's generating electricity, we have this reliance upon it. But they also come with risks, and often risks that we haven't yet properly understood. So a few things. One is that the way that we look at this is that the issue around hydropower development is that we have excellent engineers. Maria is one of them. We have people who know how to build dams. Actually, I'm an engineer and I'm taught how to build dams as well, but that's another life. We have engineers who can build dams, and we have the technology to improve how they function, where they're sited, how they work. But as with any major piece of infrastructure, there are costs, there is a budget, there are shareholders, and there are returns that are required. So therefore, the design is often squeezed into a way that works economically, but may not work environmentally and socially as well as it could, and that's because those are additional costs. So there are often a very complex and diverse range of actors involved in dams. For example, you're talking about all of your finance community, you're talking about regulators, you're also talking about the landowners who either traditionally own the land or those who will be impacted by the filling of a reservoir, for example, foresters, agriculture. So you have a large number of stakeholders that you have to deal with and work with to get the best out of the investment. And the issue is really, is our legislation and regulation good enough to deal with these complexities? I was in Laos for a dams roundtable around about 10 years ago, and I was sitting opposite two gentlemen that we'd invited from the Ministry of Environment in Laos, who were the environmental impact assessors. So they reviewed the documents that would come in to determine if it complied with the law and how it needed to be changed for all of the investments going in on infrastructure into Laos. And so we spoke to him about the challenges with hydropower development and how they could be improved and what was required and what was needed. And he said to me, the problem we have is that when there is a feasibility study for a large dam, we get a truckload of paper turning up. Feasibility studies, economic assessments. We have huge amounts of material given to us to review. And that has to go into the environmental impact assessment team to review, but they're also reviewing every other piece of infrastructure in Laos. So I said, okay, well, how many people are in your team? And he said, you're looking at it. It's me and it's him. So the capacity of countries to be able to absorb this type of development requires much more investment to ensure that they are fit for the future in terms of how that infrastructure and how that hydropower works for them going forward. So going back to, are these instruments and mechanisms enough? This is a dam collapse from 2018 I cannot remember the name of the dam now, but it was the one that was under construction at the time. And this is some of the consequences of being unaware of the risks during construction as well as during operation, and the impact of this on livelihoods, for example. So although not hydropower related, you're also probably aware of the Brumadinho and the Rio Doce tailings dam from mining in mountainous areas in the Amazon that collapsed, and then, of course, devastated entire river basins, killed lots of people. So they weren't hydropower, but the same principles apply in terms of just the construction and the risks that are there with these big pieces of infrastructure. That being said, if you ever get the chance to go to a large-scale hydropower site, say yes, because they are amazing examples of engineering, and they are often in the remote, unique parts of the world. I was lucky enough to go to the Gibe 3 complex in Ethiopia to see the construction of their latest dam, and they have cascaded these huge dams in one river system. And there have been lots of challenges and lots of problems downstream. But what they've done is they've concentrated hydropower down a particular mountain gorge, which is the best return on the flows, so they can generate the most electricity. And by concentrating the hydropower in one location, it means that they can leave other river systems less developed. They can leave other river systems free-flowing. And that's important to concentrate where those activities are, to try and ensure that we do leave river systems free-flowing, going back to the slide that Maria showed earlier on. Now, the issue with being able to regulate and govern hydropower is that there are multilateral environmental agreements. There are the Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. There are various corporate policies and financial institution policies. And what they all say is, make sure that you protect the landowners, the people who have the actual ancestry and the rights of the land, and that you ensure that you do not do harm on your neighboring states. And the difficulty is that whilst they sign up to these agreements, the states, unfortunately, try and follow them, but there are, of course, knock-on effects. And so in many cases, these things are not very well adhered to. Financial institutions have their policies. What tends to happen with those policies is that they become very tight and very rigid, and what you would want to see, good policy on how to control the finance used for dams or what you would expect to see from it. But the problem is that often countries will then turn to other financiers who don't have that same rigid type of framework from a policy perspective and use finance from other means to be able to fund those hydropower. And because of that, they don't then have to stick to those rigid environmental international agreed policies. So there are, of course, many loopholes in trying to build hydropower. The other thing that is a challenge with hydropower is its presence, its importance politically. There is no politician that gets very excited to go to a river basin where there isn't a dam and smashes a bottle against a tree and says, we protected this and we've done nothing. Or we've restored it and we didn't do very much, because there politically isn't very much to see. Whereas most of them will for sure queue up and smash a bottle on the crest of a dam as they would a ship to celebrate their political achievement of generating a hydropower dam. And you see that through the statues and the plaques and the signatories, etc., around most big infrastructure. A little bit like the Olympics and how that generates these huge costs, and then those costs get burdened by the states. So there are political reasons why hydropower is built and why it's so important. And in many ways, it's also generating, going back to my first slide, important economic benefits for the state. So it is a very tricky topic to try and determine what's the right way forward. The the 1923 Geneva Convention specifically states, do not build dams that would affect your neighbors, but only 16 states ratified that. The UN Watercourses Convention of 97 and the UNECE Convention of 1992 all state, do not cause harm on your neighbors downstream as a consequence of building dams. But of course, hydropower dams are either areas of collaboration, but they can also be areas of conflict between states. Now, if we look at how do we solve these challenges, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hydropower Sustainability Standard, because you're right, Laura, I do sit on the protocol, and what the protocol has become is the standard. And the standard is there, driven by the International Hydropower Association, which is an industry body, to try and get its members to commit to achieving a standard of delivery for hydropower, to ensure that it focuses on healthy ecosystems, on prosperous communities, on good governance, and therefore works with Indigenous people as well who are affected by dams, and on resilient infrastructure. And so this is now being rolled out to set the minimum level of performance that is expected. And it's actually quite controversial in the hydropower world, because some of the members of the industry, of the International Hydro Association, have actually left because of the importance of this standard, because they feel they can't achieve it or they don't necessarily want to comply with it. So it's an important standard because it helps set a level playing field of expectation for dam developers and investors and countries to understand this is your opportunity to start to make better dams and better performing hydropower. I'm going to give you a few examples now of just some of the times when it can go a little bit wrong. So the Piatu River in Ecuador, in 2017, the government stated that it wanted to build a large dam on the river for hydropower generation. But in doing so, and in getting the permits and the authorizations, the authorities omitted the prior consultation with the Quechua people, who were the indigenous people, were the ancestral owners of that land. And as a consequence of that, there was, as you would expect, a problem. Not only that, but the data and the information used to help design where those dams would be was from the 1960s and the 1990s. And that's not a common problem. I've been to a dam in northern Nigeria where the data used to build it was from 1 year in the 70s, and it was the wettest year for 30 years. So the data was all wrong to design the dam. And the problem is the dam has never been filled. It's 30, 35, 40 years old. It's never been filled. It's never met its design capacity. Therefore, the economics are all wrong because it was economically designed to be full, to generate a certain flow, to deliver electricity and to deliver irrigation water. And the problem with those types of investments is then the follow-on irrigation investments don't come. The dam exists, generates power, but the actual use of that water downstream for irrigation and other things that can be economically beneficial don't also materialize after the fact. So it's sold into a framework that is never going to actually mobilize the capital needed to deliver all the benefits. With the Pitua situation, the indigenous people were supported by a coalition of organizations and environmental law groups, and they actually submitted a briefing on what they expected to see from the protection of the river system due to its unique natural and cultural heritage. And in 2019, Ecuador was obliged to adopt the measures of precautionary approaches and the restoration of activities that would affect the flows and cultural heritage of the sites. So in some ways, it's a small win, but equally, it should never have happened. We're only talking 2017. It's not that long ago. We're not talking 1927. It should be fairly straightforward to design from the beginning a better consultative process with communities to build a better, more robust dam and to build a better relationships with those people who actually owned those lands. Now, it's interesting that Hervé showed the Vjosa as well. So the Vjosa River is an area where we have interests as well. It's one of the last large free-flowing rivers in Europe, and it has, from our perspective, a huge variety of different species, including 13 globally threatened species. Now, the issue is that you may not know what's there, but you probably wipe it out with certain dams before you actually realize. There were some very, very interesting case studies, one called the Kihani spray toad. If you ever are at a loose end, look up the Kihani spray toad, which is a toad that was in Tanzania that pretty much stopped a big dam on an escarpment in a mountainous area and led to a whole range of conservation actions to move toads into New York Zoo to protect it, because they're only found because they live in the spray from the waterfall that naturally occurs. And so as soon as you put a dam in there, you effectively wipe out that species. And it costs 4 to 14 million, I can't remember which number now, of consultation and time to try and look at how they could design the system to protect that. So you have to weigh these options up. What's the right thing to do practically in those situations? But it's a very famous case. It's always worth a late night read. So the issue with the Vjosa is that the whole river system, all the way down to the delta in Albania, was at risk from the planned development of 2 dams. And these were going to be on the main stem of the river as well. They were going to trap a large amount of sediment. They were also going to affect that gravel bed system, and they would change the hydrology and dynamics of the river system. Local communities were very opposed to this, as you can imagine. This is the last free-flowing river, one of the last in Europe, and it's a beautiful part of the world. In 2021, we put forward a process with the Ministry of Environment to inform a designation process to try and protect the actual river system as a free-flowing system because of its outstanding natural value. And that's important because most of the time when you are trying to protect something, you draw a border around it and you say, I'm going to protect this bit here, and everything else is not my jurisdiction. So all sorts of things can happen. But in this particular case with the Vjosa, the decision was made to protect the entire river system as one protected area to ensure that dams could not be built in there following national and international legislation. So only recently, on March the 15th this year, the Vjosa was declared a Category 2 national park, and the result of this collaboration between what we've been starting with the Albanian government and also supported by Patagonia, the clothing company, who would put money in there to try and protect these wild places as a company that makes clothing that people would wear wandering around the Vjosa River. So it's these types of examples where we see possibilities to try and actually really take forward good, sustainable practices when it comes to hydropower. The difficulty is being able to create smart dams. So dams that respond to the social context, that they respond to the environmental context, they're aware of their place within the economy, so they are economically viable, but also that they can be anchors for really strong, sensible development in that place, in those areas as well, to support local populations and the national economy. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.